Tonight, you're not standing under a banner or staring at a map of the Holy Land. You're standing beside a ledger. Before you fall asleep, you'll watch a crusade measured in coins instead of courage. See Venice turn faith into a timetable, and follow the first small detour that nudges an army toward the wrong city entirely. The harbor is mostly dark, but the numbers are awake. Oars knock softly against hulls, counting like lazy abacuses. Somewhere in the arsenal, a contract dries on a table that smells of ink and salt. Gulls wheel over ships whose decks already feel heavier than vows. Priests mutter blessings over men who are being priced by the head, and every candle along the quay burns like a tiny decimal point. You can hear the sea, but what you really hear is interest. Every wave that rocks the ships seems to ask the same question. If salvation were priced by the mile, how far would you dare to sail, and who would own the bill at the end? If nights like this keep you company, you might consider subscribing. And if you share where and when you're listening from, perhaps the next creak of an oar will remember you there, half awake, while the ink finishes telling the army what it's worth. Because tonight's story doesn't begin with a miracle or a vision. It begins with a due date. You might not expect a crusade to begin with a receipt, but here we are, warming our hands over a quiet brazier of numbers while oars creak somewhere in the dark. Venice, that tidy city of stones and schedules, offers ships as if offering pews in a floating cathedral. Room for so many souls. Sailcloth by the acre, ropes coiled like commas waiting in a sentence. The contract is long and patient. It has margins for signatures and margins for doubt. The ink dries slower than the tide. An army that has rehearsed hymns now rehearses embarkation, counting men the way bakers count loaves. The ledger says the price is due on the first of the month, and the month arrives like a clerk with a small bell. The Crusaders have brought zeal, banners, and a shortage of coins. Venice brings patient stocks and the delicate smile of a shopkeeper who has learned to wait out the inspired. The dockyards smell of tar and brine. The arsenal, with its yards of timber stacked like disciplined forests, turns faith into a timetable. Carpenters shave planks to the rhythm of Ave Marias. Rope twists under the hands of boys who will one day be men with boats and opinions. The city measures devotion not by tears, but by tonnage. In one hall, masts lean like a grove toward a sun that is really a window. In another, cauldrons for pitch simmer like shy volcanoes. Pilgrims who once counted rosary beads now count compartments. So many places to sleep, so many barrels of biscuit, so many curious pigeons who have never seen a crossbow and do not admire it. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, old enough to notice how quickly a promise ages in sea air, hears that the army cannot pay and calmly adjusts his glasses, which is to say he adjusts the city itself, because in Venice the distinction is ceremonial. A discount is offered, which is a kind of blessing. The price is still heavy, but it comes with oars. Zara appears on the itinerary like a small cough and a long prayer. It belongs to a Christian king, which is awkward, but it also belongs to a coastline that owes Venice things, which is persuasive. The idea is explained in a manner that seems almost ethical when the wind is right. If a debt is holy, then a payment can be holy too, and surely holiness should begin nearby for reasons of convenience. Zara's walls watch the sea with the face of a person who has heard rumors and is tired of them. Banners approach, singing develops a martial key, and the sermon about Jerusalem clears its throat while the ships tie knots in someone else's future. When the city falls, the margin in the ledger turns from white into a tidy gray, as if a stain could be made presentable simply by behaving. The Crusaders are surprised by how quickly scruples fold under a strong breeze. The captains are surprised by how clean accounts can look after a siege. The faithful debate a footnote and then step over it. In taverns, men draw maps on tables with spilled wine. To the tomb of Christ, yes, but first this detour, and perhaps another. A plan is a road with joints in it. Each joint makes a sound. The second section begins with a stranger on a deck, which is itself a very Venetian sentence. He is a prince with an exile's tan and a promise like a small, shiny knife. Alexios offers gold, grain, and ships if he is restored to the purple throne. His words are stitched with silk familiar to every merchant listening. His eyes promise the safe delivery of more numbers than the dockside can count without benches. The Crusaders hear absolution braided with lucre, the harmonious chord of sin forgiven and expenses met. Venice hears arrears cancelled with interest, which is a hymn in a language the city speaks from childhood. The oath to Jerusalem receives a thoughtful cough and a new clause. The fleet turns away from the long southern road like a man deciding not to finish a difficult sentence. No one likes to admit when geography has been outvoted by arithmetic. Sailing east, they practice piety by inventory. A chest of relics is checked against a list, barrels are thumped. Candles are stored where they will least interfere with ropes. A reluctant mule is coaxed onto a ramp because there is always a mule. At night, the sea is a bill presented to the moon for approval. By day, gulls write messages that dissolve as soon as they are read. Alexios speaks again, describing Constantinople as a treasury that can open tomorrow if only its doors are set at the proper angle. The men repeat the word treasury in many languages. Someone mentions Greek fire, which is not a treasury, but behaves like one. Hard to understand and terrifyingly usable. A priest explains that indulgences work on detours. A notary explains that detours work on indulgences. If you're still conscious, feel free to roll over. The story proceeds in the same soft line, like a tide sneaking up on a meditative chair. Winter lingers around the city like an uninvited uncle. Constantinople's walls are so long that bells could lose their way between towers. Chains rest across the Golden Horn like a straight line drawn by a serious child. Watchfires count hours in small orange numbers. The Crusaders camp and wait, their resolve crisping at the edges in the cold, salt air. The city riots and settles and riots again, with the patient rhythm of a community rearranging furniture it cannot afford to replace. Dynasties wobble like stools. Alexios needs coin, and coin needs months, and months need supplies, and supplies prefer to arrive in ships that have already been promised to debts. The Crusaders learn that devotion, like wool, shrinks in fog. They learn that a rumor, once warmed by a fire, acquires the same confidence as a fact. They learn that when the wind blows from the north, tents sound like monasteries chewing. The snow tries on the role of absolution and finds it fits. Somewhere between waiting and wanting, an account book changes mood. The third section begins when patience fails its own audit. Alexios sits on the restored throne and discovers that all thrones require miracles, and miracles are out of stock. The court bleeds coin into gutters lined with opinions. Merchants whisper that the rate of hope is falling against the ducat. Negotiations fray like cuffs. In the camp, lists acquire hard edges. The phrase, "for the service of God," becomes "for the service of the contract," with so little effort that one wonders whether letters ever intended to stay in their first positions. Rhetoric rolls out the siege engines with all the courtesy of a host setting extra plates. The walls are tested because walls are always interested in whether they are still walls. Trust shrinks, hunger grows. A priest blesses a ram as if it were a pilgrim with a wooden head. The city that once converted barbarians with mosaics now contemplates being converted by arithmetic. When the wall breaks, the noise is not a roar but an account settling. The bells begin, and then they do not stop, because bells have mileage to claim and will not be cheated. Fires handle the bookkeeping of fear. Relics move from their shelves to backpacks, acquiring the resigned air of statues on vacation. Chalices become coin by the ancient method of movement. Clerks inventory saints' bones with the steadiness that would flatter marble. On one street, a soldier haggles over the price of brocade as if haggling were a sacrament. On another, a boy sits on a bronze hippodrome horse and learns that history is a kind of ladder used mainly by children. Hymns migrate sideways to small chapels that suddenly understand what intimacy is for. The main nave of the city, if a city can have one, belongs to mules and rams that go where counts gently push them. For 3 days, the bells interpret everything. At dusk of the third, they fall silent, exhausted, and the ledger smiles modestly, balanced for the first time in months. The vow that sailed from the west has been paid for, and in paying, changed its name. By the time we reach the fourth stretch, the new empire has already announced itself in the careful handwriting of clerks. It is declared over mosaics that lie awake with their eyes open. Keys jingle on Venetian belts. Coastal forts wink at each other like conspirators who prefer good lighting. Customs posts rise where repentance camps used to stand, their banners advertising reasonable rates on everything except regret. Jerusalem fades to a quiet corner of the page. The Crusade becomes a trade route wrapped in a hymn. Tariffs are the new knights. A chalice that once tasted theology now tastes assault and copper. A saint learns how to cross a ledger line without smudging. If a philosopher asks whether victory can be weighed, a quartermaster answers yes and provides the units. The Latin crown rests on a head that measures time and audits. Some men write to their families that God has worked in mysterious ways. Others write that the mysteries have been itemized and are payable in quarterly installments. Someone coins a phrase about the empire of the sea, and the phrase behaves like a small boat, tidy, buoyant, and not too curious. Venice keeps the lanes, the West keeps the story. Constantinople keeps the scars, the East keeps notes on all three. In the Agora, a child hears the word indulgence and repeats it happily because it sounds like a sweet. In a scribal room, a notary calculates how long it takes for a promise to rename itself prophet. The answer is the length of a siege conducted at a walking pace. It is tempting to moralize, but morality, like wax, softens near lamps. So we end the episode the way the clerks would want, mildly with attention to detail. Consider the price of faith measured by the mile. Each mile demanded lumber, linen, biscuit, and a tolerable mule. Each demanded sailors who would rather be home, and sailors' wives who understood better than most the arithmetic of miracles. Each demanded a sermon with a paragraph about flexibility. When those miles pointed at Constantinople, the calculations did not become less holy. They simply changed fonts. Debt, that secular sacrament, steered the fleet through channels marked with theology, and theology felt honored to be included, even on the back pages. Venice wrote with oars. The Crusaders signed with swords. The city answered with bells and smoke. 3 instruments, 1 melody. If you're drowsy, that is all right. The bells are finished for the night. Let us linger, because lingering is inexpensive. Picture the Doge, old and brisk, standing in a boat with a canopy that knows the word ceremony in 3 languages. He cannot see the coins, perhaps, but he hears the arithmetic. Behind him, the arsenal breathes, a creature with ribs of oak and a stomach full of tar. On the quays, children trade rumors about Greek fire as if swapping cards. A carpenter tests the edge of a chisel on his thumb and returns to a plank that will never know what it holds. Nearby, a clerk copies a clause that will later explain why a saint traveled the length of a continent in a sack. These are small gestures. They are also sails. History is built from them like a ship built from thousands of little whittled yeses. When people asked later how a crusade came to sack a Christian city, explanations proliferated like pigeons. Some said it was Providence working in the key of commerce. Others said it was commerce pretending to be Providence. A few reminded everyone that detours are older than Europe. But even those who argued over causation agreed on one quiet point: paperwork indoors. The contract signed on a summer wharf survived winter, survived sermons, survived the romantic stubbornness of knights who wanted the story to go one particular way. It bent as all paper bends, and it did not tear. Every time a bell rang, the parchment smiled in its cabinet. What happened to Jerusalem? It became a paragraph in a longer document, a clause to be discussed at a future meeting of ships. Pilgrims walked along decks and debated the metaphysical weight of detours. A veteran of the siege explained how brocade is valued by the yard, and another explained how saints are valued by the ounce only when absolutely necessary. A priest who had never liked arithmetic learned that indulgences can be counted but should not be, in the same way that sleep can be counted but loses something when analyzed. You might, if you're still with me, imagine the holy city as a lantern bobbing on a far jetty, while the closer light of the customs booth insists you count your candlesticks. Both lights are real. One is brighter. The other is nearer. There were scandals, of course. There are always scandals in a narrative this tidy. A commander sold a promise twice to men who had already heard it thrice. A sacred banner was used as a curtain because the draft was troublesome. A certain gentleman misunderstood a Greek inscription and purchased a philosopher's bust, believing it to be a piggy bank. These anecdotes drifted across Europe and traveled faster than remorse. They found good homes in winter halls and were repeated with the slow enjoyment of bread. They are funny, which is their job. They are sad, which is also their job. Mostly, though, they are informative about the behavior of people in rooms filled with objects they have been told are valuable in a way they do not immediately understand. When the Latin Empire finally recruits its clerks and straightens its crown, the maps in Venetian counting houses shift just slightly, like a sleeper rolling over. Distant islands move closer on paper because profit is a compass. The Bosporus learns new hours for toll collection. Monasteries discover that silence can include the scratching of quills filling in tax forms. A small chapel finds that its best relic is a door that locks. On Sundays, families in Venice eat fish and mention Constantinople, as one might mention a cousin who ran away to start a business. The city itself resumes what it loves, bargaining, building, singing through the mouth of a gondolier who has never seen a battlefield but knows exactly how war tastes to those who must pay for it. As for the bells, on the last evening of the third day they were so tired that even the pigeons showed respect. The clubbers slept. The towers considered the labor of echoing and decided to continue tomorrow. In the cold streets, you could hear the accounts settling into their drawers and the quiet of relics adjusting to their new addresses. A mule ate calmly beside a puddle that reflected a spire upside down, which is a fair summary of the week. Scholars would later describe it with phrases like structural economic pressures, which is accurate and the culmination of long-standing tensions, which is also accurate, and a turning point, which is permissible, though the point turned much more slowly than the sentence implies. The men who were there mainly remembered the smell of smoke and the feeling that the road to heaven had been diverted through a warehouse. Some evenings, much later, an old knight would tell the story to a young one and drift into a small, embarrassed silence around the part with the altars. He might cough his way to the phrase necessity. He might reach for the phrase obedience. He might take a long drink and decide on the phrase, it was winter. Meanwhile, the old Doge, if you imagine him as still alive, because he sometimes feels that way counts ships by sound. It is a habit, or wake, shout, silence. Each sound is a comma, and the sentence is always concludable but never concluded. This too is how the story survives. Paced, repetitive, a litany full of soft punctuation. If salvation were priced by the mile, you would ask for the cheaper route, the one with gentle winds and honest bread. The Crusaders asked too, and were given a price list that included the unexpected column-headed miscellaneous. Under that column lay Zara, a prince, a winter, 3 days of bells, and an empire that learned the taste of paper. None of it was inevitable until it happened. All of it was affordable once it was due. The sea remained unimpressed, as seas are. Waves rehearsed their representing of infinity. The ships returned home not to applause, but to invoices. And the ledger, serene as a saint with a ruler, closed itself for the night, leaving the last line blank in case a later hand wanted to add a small tired note. Paid in full faith, included receipts available upon request. Now the room is dim. The characters, who were always more like numerals, climb back into their columns. Venice braced carefully so as not to disturb the parchment. Constantinople lies still, which is its oldest habit. The bells consider their chores for tomorrow and negotiate them down. If you are still awake, there is nothing to decide. The contract has already been filed. We will leave it there then with the soft certainty that comes when a story ends, not in triumph or tragedy, but in balance, as if the world were a scale that has agreed just for a time to keep its arms level. You might not expect the smell of herring to keep time for a whole economy, but for a few quiet centuries in the north, the calendar clicked forward on a fish. It was not a dramatic calendar with wars and red ink and coronations in gold, more of a parchment wall chart pinned above a counting table, stained by salt, annotated by the weather. When the shoals gathered in the gray water off Scania, the Hanseatic merchants stirred the way bees do when a cloud passes. They folded maps that were already familiar, walked slowly down wharves they can navigate in the dark, and asked practical questions like how many barrels were truly empty and how many were only optimistically so. If you're still awake by the time we reach the section on brine strengths, you're doing wonderfully. Feel free to subscribe with whatever gesture passes for a nod when you're half asleep. Nothing urgent will happen here. The fish will arrive when they arrive. The boats will leave when the tide thinks fit. The rhythm began earlier than the shoals, of course. In Baltic towns that repeat their gabled roofs like good manners, coopers tapped rings into place on new casks that would not complain about long voyages or arguments about taxes. A good barrel can hold both fish and policy if packed correctly. Cloth factors folded heavy bolts for trade, not because cloth belonged at the herring fair, but because no merchant respects a journey that only earns one profit. In Lubeck, they weighed the advice of the last season the way a careful cook weighs flour by feeling. The guild masters locked their books with keys that were slightly too large for the locks, because symbolism pleases people who enjoy rules. On the walls, wooden calendars showed saints' days with small nails hammered and where memory liked reinforcement. Somewhere close to Michaelmas, a nail glittered with fresh polish. Even the bargemen who disliked saints trusted nails. The passage to the sound was never dramatic unless one insisted on drama. The cogs moved at a pace that encouraged conversation about wind and shoes. Crews sorted ballast and superstition with the same method. Keep enough of both, but not so much that it interferes with loading. A clerk rehearsed the Danish tolls aloud under his breath as if they were prayers. So many marks for so many masts, exemptions for grain, ambiguities for ambition. He knew the king's collectors would run their fingers over ropes the way moneylenders run their fingers over coins, professionally, without cruelty, with a certain affection. At night, lanterns trembled in the rigging and turned the fleet into a small city practicing sleep. When the market opened along the shingle of Scania, it did not leap to life. It very politely woke up. Tents unrolled like commas. Sheds constructed of nothing but obedience stood in lines that pleased the eye and the magistrates. The church set up a portable altar because even herring deserves structure. Brine kettles breathed like mild dragons. There were rules for everything, none of them glamorous, and all of them remembered. You salted only so fast, stirred only so long, tumbled the fish only so high. Men disagreed profoundly about where high began, and those disagreements earned them the right to stand slightly apart while agreeing about everything else. The famous paintings of these fairs mostly omit the ladles, which did the real diplomacy. In the second scene, the beer joins the story, not loudly, because the North preferred its drama malted and poured at room temperature. Hanseatic towns brewed to the calendar like farmers to the rain. Winter beers traveled. Summer beers stayed home and told stories about brawls that never happened. There were laws, of course, but they read more like recipes. Barley is faithful, wheat is unreliable, hops are stern but fair. A brewer in Danzig kept a stick in his mash that he refused to wash, convinced that the stick remembered a perfect batch and would remind the next one. The guild let him keep his stick because the beer paid the rent on the street. Another brewer argued that herring brine stored in the alley behind his brewhouse sealed, obviously, and guarded by 3 cats changed the air for the better. This may have been true, or it may have been marketing. The cats were real either way. Markets behave like monasteries when they are well run. There were canonical hours for everything: the opening of casks, the laying of fish, the measuring of salt by hand for reasons that were both traditional and practical. A man who could tell the difference between the weight of wet salt and dry salt in the palm was treated with deference, even by those who pretended they could tell too. Once a day, a bell insisted that people count. They counted fish in barrels, yes, but also accidental blessings, an easy wind, a dry shore, an inspector with a soft voice. Someone used the back of a tally stick to calculate how many pints of beer it took to persuade men from 3 different harbors to agree on the size of small. The answer was several, which is one of the more useful units in the late medieval North. Small absurdities enforce large order. The Danish collectors sometimes stamped seals in wax that had been warmed at a cook fire until it smelled faintly of onions, which gave official documents a domestic bouquet. A Lübeck merchant with a thin mustache put a ribbon on his most reliable barrel so he could recognize it from far away, as if it were a child in a crowded church. A Swedish fisherman who believed iron scared herring among the kettles wore wool gloves with iron coins sewn into the cuffs, presumably to frighten the fish properly while also staying warm. If any of this sounds unscientific, breathe easily. The science lived in the repetition. Each year tuned the next 1/2 a note closer to durable. By the time the convoys turned for home, the ledgers were already telling the story the way ledgers do, with perfect confidence and no imagination. This is the 3rd section, where cogs and carts carry away not triumphs but arrangements. In one town, the weighhouse measured every cask with a beam that had been in place so long it had acquired a personality, one of those beams that resents haste. Clerks recorded measures in a script that looked as if it were trying not to be noticed. Attached to many entries was the small word good, which in mercantile language means predictable. That was the Hanseatic ideal, not riches, but bewildering steadiness. If you require a punchline, it goes like this: the richest man at the fair was the one who most dreaded novelty. Convoys kept time for whole regions. A cog returning in September meant a winter would include lighted windows until Candlemas. Children learned to read from lists of arrivals pinned to doors. It is a gentle way to discover that words can bring warmth. Carts with iron-shod wheels took the heavy barrels inland, at a complaining pace that suited everyone who had no desire to run. On paved ways, the barrels hummed. On ruts, they thumped. A musician once tried to write down the tune of a 10-barrel cart, concluded there were only 2 notes, and sold the composition to a brewer who played it in his tavern every evening at closing, which is one way to honor infrastructure. Inevitably, there were small calamities that behaved like educational materials. Some years, the shoals kept indecently deep water, and the fishermen glared at the horizon as if sulking could attract seafood. Brine kettle fires sometimes learned they were fires and chased their curiosity along. A shed roof before remembering they were employed, not free. A toll collector misheard a clerk and wrote that a cargo consisted of angels, causing a brief but hilarious quarrel with a theologian. The angels turned out to be eels. A guild in Rostock argued for 3 months about whether beer measured in Hamburg pints should be paid for in Greifswald pints when the beer traveled across jurisdictions. The compromise pay in one, drink in the other pleased everyone after several experiments. We drift, as towns eventually did, toward the Dutch with their brisk innovations. The fourth rhythm arrives like a ship with newer rigging, the herring bus, blessed with the idea of gutting fish at sea and packing them immediately in beautifully disciplined brine. This did not destroy Hanseatic habits so much as remind them that habits do not anchor in all weathers. Dutch barrels arrived with corners of pride. They left with profits that looked slightly embarrassed because of how tidy they were. Hanseatic merchants complained that the new methods were too fast, as if decency demanded a certain number of delays per season. But complaints, once properly invoiced, are not an obstacle to change. The brine learned new arithmetic. The fairs learned to look over their shoulders. Meanwhile, beer answered as beer always does, with mild adjustments and the suggestion of continuity. Brewers added or subtracted hops with the solemnity of men tuning bells. Some argued for stronger beer to withstand longer voyages. Others argued for more beer to withstand longer arguments. The guilds produced decrees with charming nouns. Any ale found dim or lacking courage would be discouraged by inspectors carrying ladles, and then they went back to their coppers to do whatever actually worked. Fishermen who once spent winters mending nets learned to spend some winters learning Dutch words for parts of a boat that had not previously existed in their lives. Children grew up hearing two languages arguing politely across a table, which is a very northern sound. There's a smaller, softer story woven among these threads, and it belongs to the men who carried the money, not the merchants. The carriers. They guarded their packs with a nonchalant suspicion that passed for optimism. They slept in lofts above shops where the smell of fish rose through the night like a neutral sermon, an odor without advice. They counted by touch and bent fingers. On Sundays, they watched small processions and wondered how many statues could fit in a single crate. They played dice with a surprising amount of reverence for the rules, because in their world, rules were not an enemy of luck. They were a container for it. If anyone asked whether herring could save a soul, they shrugged and said, very likely, but not quickly. By late autumn, the fairs had emptied down to their bones. The earth kept the shapes of the sheds for a while, like a memory of guests. The beach held little circles of white where salt had been careless. The church packed its portable altar carefully, because nothing ruins the winter like a broken corner on a sacred table. Somewhere in the last wagon, a forgotten ladle clinked in rhythm with the ruts, as if trying to sing itself back to the sea. It would be used all winter for soups that failed to surprise anyone. A clerk sat by a small window and rewrote the final list the last time, both because lists benefit from rewriting and because he liked the way the numbers marched up the page like a well-behaved militia. In spring, everything began again without bothering to announce itself. Coopers hammered. Rope makers walked backward for miles. Apprentices recited rules out of tune like children muttering poetry while sweeping. The saints' nails on the wall calendar sat exactly where they had last year, because accuracy is restful. A boy who had measured salt in his palm the year before measured it again and found, to his private wonder, that his hand had grown. He adjusted, which is how institutions survive without ever admitting to the strenuousness of it. A brewer kissed his unwashed matchstick in a way that pretended not to be affectionate. Cats patrolled the alleys with renewed optimism. The air smelled like brine wanting a reason. If we need a conclusion, and we do not, but we can afford a gentle one, let it be the kind that closes a ledger without locking it. The Hanseatic world of herring and beer did not whisper great philosophies into the ear of Europe. It asked quieter questions. Does the brine cover the fish? Does the barrel hold? Does the road, even muddy, reach the next town by nightfall? These are bedtime questions, the inventory of comfort. When the Dutch changed the answers, the old towns replied with different questions and kept going. The sound still took tolls. The wayhouses still frowned at haste. The markets still opened like polite eyelids each year. The saints kept their nails. The merchants kept their habits. The fish kept their schedules with a dedication that mocked human seriousness. If you glance back now, and you may, lazily, you might see a map in which nothing seems to move, and yet everything rearranges itself with the patience of tides. The North made wealth out of rhythm. It trusted that barrels packed without panic would arrive with dignity. It suspected that beers brewed within the law would comfort more people than beers that went around it. It was right often enough to keep repeating itself. And when the fair season had truly ended, and the last ledger was stacked beneath the second to last, and the final bell had practiced its winter silence, someone in a narrow street, in a town with a name you could forget without guilt, lifted a plain wooden mug, tasted something exactly as expected, and said the most valuable sentence in the Hanseatic language. The same again, please. You might not expect a government to tax daylight, but England once tried, very politely, by counting windows. The year was 1696, which is a year that prefers to be written in ink with a slow nib, and the scheme itself was calm in its ambition. If a house were many eyes, it must be prosperous, and if it was prosperous, it could afford to squint a little for the treasury. Clerks drew up tables that looked like multiplication charts for sunshine. 3 to 9 windows paid this, 10 to 19 paid that. 20 or more paid the sort of fee that makes you silently close a shutter out of thrift. It was not a dramatic law, only a patient one, the kind that sits in a ledger and waits for you to grow into it. If you re still awake by the time we get to the argument about whether a fanlight counts as a window if the fan looks shy, feel free to subscribe with a gentle blink. The inspectors will not hurry us. They prefer a slow walk around the block and a head count of glass. The new tax had an old-fashioned courtesy. It did not invade a home. It stood on the pavement and admired architecture with a ruler. Assessors learned the art of leaning back to see the attic and of stepping forward to confirm a basement greeting. They developed a professional squint. They compared notes about bow windows and orioles the way gardeners compare notes about roses. Mildly, competitively, with admiration for trellis and Latin. A question that delighted them was whether a window entirely filled with jars could still be said to open light, and therefore the purse. In one town, a grocer stacked pickled onions against the pane, so precisely that his shop looked like a scientific experiment in refraction. The inspector smiled, counted anyway, and recommended the onions. The law had room for humor, but not for mercy. Numbers politely refused both. Houses began to think about their faces. Masons kept bricks aside for necessary alterations, a phrase everyone understood. Plasterers practiced the small art of pretending a window had never happened. A neat fill, a skim coat, a little sand to match the mood of the wall, and then a shrug as if the house had always been a patient creature that blinked less than you remembered. Carpenters made false sashes for symmetry, painted on stone, with perfect shadows in the corners so the building would not look embarrassed in public. This was not rebellion, it was etiquette. Streets that used to smile wide now practiced a reserved expression suitable for town rates. If anyone asked what had become of the parlor window, the correct answer was that fashions change. Inside, families rearranged their day like furniture. Curtains migrated to the center of rooms to pretend at privacy that the bricked aperture no longer bothered to give. Candles learned new routes from drawer to desk. The careful householder discovered that a mirror earns back more light than it costs in polish, and that a kettle, rubbed like a well-loved coin, can reflect a whole afternoon with the loyalty of a dog. Children learned to read with their backs to the remaining window, so they would not cast shadows on their own alphabets. There's a specific music to a room coached by thrift. The match's little hiss, the spoon's click testing the candlestick's weight, the gentle arithmetic of wicks. If you tip your head, you can hear the faint applause of savings. Inspectors were not villains. They were connoisseurs of pains. The best of them kept small notebooks in which they drew domestic doodles, 6/6 sash in Bishopsgate, handsome fanlight in Bath, suspicious pair of cellar grates in York that winked like mischief. They shared professional gossip about one magistrate who swore a circular window counted as 1.5 because it was ambitiously round. Loopholes grew like ivy. Was a window that never opened a window that could be taxed for air it failed to admit? Did a borrowed light high in a stairwell belong to the house or to the sky? One creative household argued that their wall of small bottles was not glass but medicine, and therefore exempt on humanitarian grounds. The assessor, unmoved, admired the collection and added a tidy sum to the assessment. The state appreciates novelty. It prefers revenue. Trades adapted with the warmth of people who appreciate a living. Candle makers printed price lists that read like lullabies. Tallow by the pound, beeswax by the grace of the hive, rushlights by the bundle for those who like their evenings moderate. Glaziers, paradoxically, did not starve. They learned the craft of subtraction. To remove a sash without wounding the wall became its own advertisement. Some offered reversible reductions, a phrase that promises nothing and everything. Brick it now, sir, and when Parliament comes to its senses next year, 5 years, sometime we restore it as if it had only been napping. There is comfort in reversible decisions, even when no one reverses them. Meanwhile, peddlers in polished tin flourished. A shiny plate on a dark mantle counts as optimism you can hang. The tax encouraged a species of architecture that looked thoughtful. Townhouses grew taller, but not brighter, as if aspiring to polite conversation with the weather. In spa cities where people came to be seen, facades wore fake smiles and paint, the symmetry intact, the apertures imaginary. Visitors posed, and nobody corrected them. Country estates, full of opinions, solved the problem by moving their largest windows to rooms with names spoken only on tours. The orangery, the long gallery, the small library designed for short letters. Servants who lived where light was a rumor patiently located their own son by scent and habit. In attics, trunks found again the things they had always known. The slope of the roof, the honest angle of noon. Even darkness began to feel designed. In coffee houses where taxes are digested more thoroughly than pastries, pamphleteers rehearsed the speech that would be delivered many winters, hence about the health of the poor and the right to light. They did not always agree on rights, but they were united on comfort. A doctor published a treatise explaining that narrow pupils made for narrow lives. His evidence was a cat that preferred windowsills and lived to a prodigious age. Another gentleman wrote of the moral hazards of bricking because virtue, he said, enjoys supervision. The printers were delighted by the debate, which sold gently on damp mornings. The government preferred figures to philosophy and printed tables. Tables sleep well at night. As the decades turned, the tax grew like a hedge, pruned here, widened there, still very much itself. Rates rose. Exemptions budded. Houses complicated their faces as if practicing an expression for a portrait. Builders learned to group windows into treaty-like clusters to keep the count agreeable. 2 generous openings and a small apology tucked to one side. In the north, where days are economical in winter, householders invented the art of timing chores to the hour when the angle of sun both forgives and reveals. A maid could tell you precisely when dust prefers to confess. In the South, shutters performed morning calisthenics to modest applause from the street. If boredom is the mother of craft, taxation is the aunt who brings needles and recommends patterns. There were, as there always are, stories. A landlord arranged the bricking of 2 windows and attempted to charge his tenants for the bricks, the mortar, and the moral improvement. They protested by placing an oil painting of a window over the space, a trompe-l'oeil that made the room look like it remembered better days. Visitors were fooled, the inspector was not. A parson, determined to keep his study bright for sermons that disliked the dark, paid the duty with a sigh and a footnote about Caesar's things and gods, a division the congregation appreciated more in theory than in candles. A boarding school economized it by teaching penmanship in the corridor, where a borrowed light offered a lesson in humility to boys who would later sign ledgers as if signatures were weather. Somewhere in this long, slow choreography, the bricked window stopped being an absence and became a sign you could read. It told you about the temper of a century that managed its mornings with arithmetic. It made a pumice-colored patch on a facade that otherwise proud owners kept scrubbed, a patch that said both we contributed and we endured. It taught painters a new shade of honest gray. It taught architects to argue in footnotes. It taught children that a rectangle on a wall can be a story, and that every story includes a line about money. The tax did not make England dark. It made it deliberate. Even the fog seemed to respect the system, arriving on schedule, departing with receipts. Repeal, when it came in 1851, behaved like a polite guest leaving early. There were speeches and tall hats and practical men congratulating each other for liberating light, which had been illuminating houses stubbornly all along. The newspapers printed illustrations of fresh openings like miracle cures. Glaziers returned with the promised reversals. Masons learned to undo their own grammar. Carpenters discovered that a memory of a sash fits better than a guess. But not all holes were reopened. Some walls had enjoyed their stillness. Some rooms had developed careers that suited dusk. A few owners found bricked windows aesthetically satisfying, as minimalism always waits patiently at the end of ornament. The city, only slightly brighter, achieved the pleasant expression of someone who has found an old coin in a familiar coat. Long after the last invoice was retired, the habit of counting lingered. House hunters strolled past terraces and performed a little arithmetic, the way one hums a hymn out of season. 10 windows across, 2 bricked, story suggested. Tourists in certain towns point at pale rectangles as if they were reading plaques, and guides nod gravely as guides do. Photographers adore the patches. They know how a subtraction can balance a composition. If you stand quietly on a late afternoon street, you can watch light browse among the facades like a distracted scholar, reading, skipping, returning, stroking the parapets where unnecessary cornices still practice being necessary. The sun, tax-exempt, continues its itinerary. What remains most soothing about the window tax is how little it asks of the imagination. There are no villains in capes, only clerks with pencils. No uprisings, only letters. No palaces stormed, only shutters adjusted with a private sigh. It is the history of a country tiding its budget with a broom both too stiff and strangely gentle. It produced a nation of rooms that learned, by habit, to make their own weather. It rewarded thrift, punished exuberance lightly, and gave future painters something to think about at breakfast. If you feel the world growing quiet around you now, it is because we have arrived at the natural speed of this subject, a soft pace measured in pains and seasons. And so, as the evening folds itself, consider the small rituals inherited from that era. The way we still draw curtains as if the street might send an inspector. The way we count the squares of a sash without meaning to. The way we feel in certain sober rooms that the air respects budgets. Somewhere, a house with a bricked window and a story it has told to nobody all day is practicing its rest face for the neighborhood. The patch holds the last light a moment longer, then lets it go without a bell. The matches are asleep in their box. The kettle hums about nothing in particular. You have learned a method for measuring comfort with a very old instrument. One palm, one candle, one wall that knows what it used to let through, and if you are not already drifting, you will be soon, with the pleasant assurance that the taxman no longer counts your dreams, and that the night, generously underasked, will carry you the rest of the way. You might not expect a city to regulate the softness of a loaf, but for several quiet centuries, the English did exactly that, with a law so gentle and so thorough that it could tell you how much bread a penny ought to invite home in winter rain. The assize of bread and ale sounds stern like a judge with flour on his sleeves, yet it was simply a promise that if grain grew dear, the loaves would politely grow small, and if grain grew cheap, the loaves would thoughtfully grow large, and all the while, nobody needed to raise their voice. If you were still awake by the time we reached the part about the ale conner, S. Leather Breeches, which is a real office and not a tavern nickname, feel free to subscribe with the same restraint as a baker weighing salt. Or don't. The assize will carry on at its own drowsy pace either way, moving from measure to measure the way a cat moves along a warm wall. The whole system began not with hunger, but with arithmetic. Grain prices were posted like weather, a hush in the market, a whisper among millers, a clerk with a quill who had made peace with numbers. Out of those numbers came a table, and out of the table came a loaf. The unit of grace was called a farthing loaf, which is an amount you can hold the way you hold a soft opinion. Bakers were told quite kindly that when a quarter of wheat cost this many shillings, the farthing loaf would weigh that many ounces, and if the quarter cost more, the loaf would lose a little dignity, but keep its honesty. Nobody cared about the shape. They cared about the weight, which could be proven by a scale that did not argue. There is something soothing about a law that does not demand perfection, only proportion. If you owned a pair of scales and a habit of fairness, you were halfway to being a saint. Markets learned to read themselves out loud. A bell might ring at dawn, not for piety, but for buying. Carts arrived with grain in sacks that exhaled quietly when a corner was loosened. Dogs circled and decided against careers in milling. Every few weeks, someone official would consult the same table, cop it in town after town, like a recipe written by a country with good handwriting, and announce the new expected weight. Bakers listened while their ovens breathed. They carved new wooden pegs with the proper notch, so a batch could be divided obediently on the bench. A trick of the trade as practical as sleep. A good bench tells time by the sound of dough collapsing into itself. A good oven keeps its own counsel and remembers yesterday's heat. Between the table and the hearth, a town learned to trust that supper would not surprise it. The assize did not trouble itself with crust and crumb, though everyone had opinions about both. It accepted that one family might prefer a tight, serious loaf for soup and another a soft, friendly loaf for butter, and it left such matters to grandmothers. But it cared about salt, because salt pretends to weigh more than it gives, and about water, which composes generosity when it is only haste. Inspectors, whose job was unglamorous and oddly calming, carried small knives and polite expressions. They would buy a loaf, walk to a table, cut it with the persuasiveness of a librarian opening a book, and look for truth inside. If the crumb glistened like an apology, there had been too much water. If it resisted like philosophy, there had been too little. The preferred result was a quiet conversation between yeast and wheat under a crust that did not boast. Bread, like law, ought to be calm in the middle. Bakers marked their loaves the way skylarks mark the air, not to claim ownership so much as to confess responsibility. Some marks were initials, some were symbols learned from an uncle, some were small stars because the apprentice once cut a star and the customers smiled. A marked loaf meant that if the scale frowned, the magistrate knew whose oven had been hasty. Punishment, when it came, belonged to the theater of gentle humiliation. A light loaf might earn the pillory, but not for cruelty. The pillory in bread matters was more like a public tutorial with wind. The baker stood among jokes, nodded, promised to check his pegs, and later that night returned to a bench dusted like a winter windowsill to start again. It is possible, likely, even that most bakers bribed the scale not with coin but with attention. While bread minded its ounces, ale minded its morals. Ale was liquid bread, and the assize counted its honesty by the penny pot. The measure varied the way dialect varies, yet everywhere men and women agreed that ale should be strong enough to cheer the law without arguing with it. Enter the ale cunner, a public officer whose tasks were as understated as his title is memorable. He tasted, but he did not drink. He judged, but he did not sermonize. He wore leather breeches not for fashion, but because one of the tests, which tradition keeps repeating with a straight face, involved spilling ale on a bench, sitting in it, and observing the stickiness upon rising. If you left your seat as if it missed you, the brew held too much sugar and therefore too much promise. If you rose without complaint, the ale was honest enough for a parish afternoon. A city regulated by breeches knows the comfort of measured expectations. Alehouses posted their prices on small boards that looked like excuses. The numbers changed when malt went dear or cheap, always chasing balance the way a cat chases dust. You could sit beneath the board with a penny and meet a pint that respected arithmetic. There were no tasting notes and few adjectives, only the contentment that comes from a drink that does what it says on the board. Tavern keepers learned the art of quiet dilution in those years when prices frowned, just enough to keep the bench friendly, not enough to wake the connor's britches. In towns where faith ran high, the same man who read the song might keep an eye on the measures, which is a kind of municipal poetry, weight, volume, and virtue in courteous collaboration. Every law breeds hobbyists. The assize encouraged a small society of people who loved weights more than outcomes. They waxed their scales and admired them as if they were little crescent moons that had decided to retire indoors. They debated the merit of wooden versus iron peels for transferring dough to oven floors, not because the law required it, but because the law gave them permission to be meticulous in public. A few wrote manuals that are mostly lists: how to test a loaf with a finger, how to listen to the knock on the bottom, how to calculate the day's batch size using a scoop that had a delightful name and a fixed opinion. The manuals, when found centuries later by patient archivists, smell faintly of flour even now, an olfactory joke of the kind time enjoys. Sometimes grain failed, and even a table could not help. In those years, the assize became an etiquette of disappointment. The town cried mercy in circulars. Bakers were told to reduce their loaves again and again, until the farthing loaf looked like the memory of a loaf, a small consolation that still understood its job. People were hungrier than stories prefer to admit, but hunger has its rituals, and the ritual of a weighed loaf is one of them. It says, "Even now we will be fair. Even now we will count together." The pillory was not used in those seasons. One does not scold what cannot be helped. Instead, the church opened its slow rooms. The town opened its grain stores, and ale mild. Dutiful ale remained priced as if kindness were immeasurable. Elsewhere, standards multiplied the way seedlings do in a warm week. The owl measured cloth from finger to shoulder. The yard measured the ambition of a garden. The gallon taught households to narrate stew. All of these rested on the same pillow as the loaf. The faith that measurement, patiently applied, can make strangers keep promises. You could enter a town where you knew nobody, point at a loaf on a shelf, and be reasonably certain how much honesty would come wrapped in that crust. The mark on the top was not a brand. It was a handshake between people who preferred not to speak. In places where money shook itself into odd coins, bread steadied the hand. In the small hours, when ovens mutter and apprentices pretend not to doze on sacks of flour, the craft looked less like commerce and more like weather. Heat has moods. Too hot and the crust sulks. Too cool, and the crumb tells you every step you rushed. Bakers learned the trick of testing the oven mouth with a scrap of paper or a pinch of flour, watching how quickly it brown whispered its answer. They guarded sourdough like a neighbor's secret. They were not scientists, except that they were because patience plus observation equals a kind of science that never feels the need to publish. The Assize peered gently over their shoulders, approving not technique but outcome. A supervisor who believes in you as long as the scale agrees. The most exciting thing that could happen to a loaf under the Assize was to be cut in half in public by someone with a small knife and an official hat. Even then, the excitement was mild, the crowd's interest more of a village yawn than a scandal. Once in a while, a magistrate confiscated an oven to make a point. More often, he merely confiscated an afternoon and made a speech about equity in which all the verbs were polite. The audience nodded and thought about supper. A child held the confiscated light loaf and considered the concept of mass. In this way, the Assize taught physics by anecdote, which is the gentlest possible approach to Newton. There were regional preferences, of course. In the north, loaves took on the seriousness of weather that means business. In the south, crusts flirted with olive oil when nobody was looking. Some towns allowed spice in festival bread, which the Assize monitored with the tolerant expression of a teacher who has seen this trick before. Buns marched in warm rows at Easter, ciphered with their little white algebra. At Michaelmas, wheat remembered summer and pretended not to mind the turn toward candlelight. Through it all, the law kept its table and the market kept its manners. If you purchased a loaf with a groat, you expected not an adventure but a result. Meanwhile, the ale cunner walked his rounds like a parish-sized planet, orbiting benches and peering at pots. He had enemies only in theory and friends mostly in practice. Brewers learned to greet him as one greets a weather vane, warmly, with no hope of influence. He sipped, nodded, left a coin, and moved on. When ale grew too strong because grain was cheaper than water in an odd season, he suggested moderation without fuss. When it grew too weak because someone was ambitious about profits, he adjusted the price with the bored accuracy of a sundial. His ledger contained more adjectives than you might expect: wholesome, cheerful, honest, unassuming. He did not write excellent, not because excellence is illegal, but because it is unnecessary. Ale needed to be adequate in the way daylight is adequate. As centuries idled forward, the Assize learned to accommodate new flowers, new pans, and the occasional foreign enthusiasm. Bakers experimented with steam for the sake of crust that went from dignified to radiant. Some, whisper it, brushed the top with milk. The law, uninterested in glamour, weighed the result and smiled if the number was right. Every so often, a pamphlet argued that free markets ought to supervise bread as they supervised ambition. Yet, whenever markets were left alone too long, they remembered being dramatic, and people asked the Assize to come back and hum a steady tune in the corner. Drama is a poor breakfast. The quiet brilliance of the system was that it made deceit exhausting. To cheat successfully, a baker had to plan new wooden pegs every week, watch the clerk's table like a cat staring at a clock angle for moisture that would evaporate at precisely the right scandalous moment, and persuade a scale designed by people who adored balance to betray its first love. All of that effort to earn a day of pillory, 2 polite lectures, and the same arithmetic tomorrow. Honesty turned out to be the path of least resistance. The Assize suspected this all along and set its chair beside the bench to enjoy the spectacle of good behavior happening for practical reasons. By the time industrial bakeries learned to exhale steam by the acre and to knead with machines that looked like friendly planets, the habits of the Assize had seeped into the walls. Labels took over the task of ale mark, nutrition by number, weight in several systems just to be sociable, a suggested serving size that imagines you are more restrained than you are. The ale cunner resigned his breeches and was replaced by a laboratory which neither sits in a puddle nor tells good stories. Yet if you stand in a queue with a small coin in your hand and a large appetite, you feel the ghost of the farthing loaf counting kindly on your behalf. You still expect fairness to be something you can slice. There is, at the edge of all this weighing, a philosophy with no hurry to announce itself. It says that a community can be measured not only by what it celebrates loudly, but by what it regulates softly. Bread and ale are not monuments. They are repetitions. They are the sort of daily contracts that teach trust by not making a fuss. A person who has eaten a just loaf all his life is prepared to believe in other just things. Measures in the cloth market, inches in the carpenter's promise, minutes in a sermon that keeps to the point. The assize does not claim credit. It is content to be background, like the slide of a bench on flagstones, like yeast pretending to do nothing and accomplishing breakfast. Imagine now a late medieval evening working itself into night. The oven's last heat goes to a pan of tomorrow's beginnings. The baker's daughter chalks sums on a black door for fun. The street outside collects the day like a quiet cupboard. Across town, the alehouse wipes tables with a cloth that has met better days and still believes in them. A cunner closes his ledger and thinks approvingly of the word wholesome, which has earned its rest. The magistrate puts the knife back in its drawer. On kitchen tables, crumbs pose as punctuation. Someone knocks the heel of a loaf against the board and hears a note that means the middle is right. Nobody announces any of this. It is simply understood like the tide meaning well. If you listen closely, the assize is essentially a lullaby sung by numbers. It is a tune about ounces and pence and quarts and pots, about fairness moving through a town like a mild breeze that doesn't mind alleys. It promises that tomorrow will be sufficiently like today to make planning a pleasure. The excitement it offers is the tiny excitement of a scale settling true. This is not the sort of story that keeps you up. It is the sort that discovers you asleep and carefully does not wake you. And so the benches cool, the ovens drowse the marks on the loaves, look up at the ceiling like small stars that are satisfied with their work. And the night unmeasured and generous pours itself like ale into a cup no ledger has ever needed to count. You might not expect a holy war to begin with a spreadsheet, but the Fourth Crusade opened its eyes to columns before it ever saw a cross. The title of the ledger sat there quietly in Venetian ink, the kind that dries with a tidy confidence. Numbers filed themselves into place like monks finding their pews. There was the price of ship timber that would never see a chapel. There were meals for oarsmen who would hear sermons only as muffled echoes across the lagoon. There were the wages of sail menders, rope splicers, and the man whose job listed with admirable clarity was to count barrels that had already been counted. If you're still awake in a few minutes, you are invited very gently to subscribe for more arithmetic disguised as destiny. But truly, spare yourself the effort if the pillow has better ideas. The point is calm. Venice offered ships, crews, and a calendar, and the Crusade accepted, the way someone accepts a coat that fits a little too well, and then forgets to ask the price. The contract named a date when the Great Armada should be ready, a date as firm as oak, which turned out to be firmer than the funds. Money was supposed to arrive like swallows in spring. Instead, it fluttered in as a few confused sparrows. And so the first prayer of the Crusade, so grand in its preface, was addressed to a ledger. Across the arsenal, where hammers talked to wood from morning to evening, Doge Enrico Dandolo walked with a kind of careful authority that knows exactly how many planks one promise requires. He counted heads as if they were precise units of sail, not souls with opinions. The yards filled with half-built galleys, elegant in the way skeletons are elegant. The docks exhaled pitch and confidence. Clerks dipped their pens into pots that had ambitions of eternity. Venice could deliver everything: instruments, crews, and a departure day with a ring to it, provided the Crusaders paid a sum that looked reasonable when whispered and astronomical when written down. The Crusade, expecting mercy to balance math, found that mercy was away on business. The shortfall was obvious even to the hopeful. Thousands who had taken the cross stayed home, pockets politely empty. The bill came before the blessing, and the blessing waited in the doorway, clearing its throat. The city did not raise its voice. Venice never needed to. It preferred the tone of a person doing mental division while smiling. The solution floated up with the tide. Since the pilgrims could not pay with coin, they might pay with labor. Dandolo suggested with an admirable absence of drama that the fleet could first sail to Zara, a Christian port inconveniently belonging to the King of Hungary, who had in one of those delicious footnotes of history also taken the cross. Venice had grievances there, and grievances, like granaries, need regular inspection. The Crusade, hungry for motion and strapped for everything else, nodded. Banners were blessed, trumpets remembered their jobs, and a sermon explained, with the soft confidence of theological footwork, that this detour was not a detour but a prologue. The word forbiddance hovered politely in the air and then drifted toward the back of the congregation. On deck, oars lay ready like long intentions. If salvation could be priced by the mile, a few miles to Zara would not tip the scale. Or so the sea said in its usual persuasive monotone. Sails bellied, gulls practiced their public speeches. The fleet rolled out across the Adriatic with the unhurried competence of an industry that has done this before. Zara's walls appeared and did what walls always do when ships arrive with contracts. They looked surprised. After a tidy siege and a season of letters written in tones ranging from concerned to disappointed, Zara surrendered. It was a transaction that went through with minimal fuss, like a rent payment that had been discussed in advance. There were murmurs among the pilgrims, and at least a few stern faces among churchmen, but the ships rocked patiently, counting interest. Debt had been fed, which meant the expedition could keep walking forward, even if its footprints now pointed in a slightly embarrassing direction. The road to Jerusalem curved quietly toward whatever would pay the invoice. There is, it turns out, a particular kind of devotion that prefers receipts. Then, as if a new page had been glued into the book, a prince drifted over the horizon. Alexios Angelos boarded the Crusader deck with a promise tucked under each arm: gold, grain, ships, and a union of churches, all tied with the ribbon of restoration. He was an exile from Constantinople, a city made of edges and domes, of markets that never stopped hiding themselves. If the Crusaders would help him reclaim his throne from the uncle who had exercised the ancient right of relatives to be inconvenient, he would repay the debt to Venice and offer supplies that sounded like a hymn. The proposition had a calm inevitability, like adding a column to an existing table. The words absolution and interest began to hum the same note. Oaths were not exactly changed. They were re-inked, like a charter that acquires an elegant new clause in the margin. The fleet, which had been trained to obey geography, now obeyed arithmetic shaped like destiny. South became east. The Bosporus waited with that quiet authority rivers have when they decide to be gates. Constantinople rose from the waterline like the memory chains across the Golden Horn, towers that blinked in Byzantine, churches with roofs that taught light to be careful. The Crusade paused to admire and to negotiate activities that feel very similar from a distance. It was winter, which is a bad season for both war and enthusiasm. Fires kept the night busy. Watchmen counted hours the way a careful cook counts spoonfuls. The city bargained through thick walls with a blend of ceremony and suspicion. The Crusaders waited outside like students who have arrived early for an exam they hadn't planned to take. When Alexios III fled, as uncles sometimes do when arithmetic becomes personal, our visiting Alexios became Alexios IV, crowned among candles that looked pleased to be included, and the ledger brightened. Promises were staged like opera. There were arrears to erase, ships to maintain, grain to distribute, a union of churches to be declared in language that was architecturally sound. A treasury that could do all this tomorrow would be ideal. In the meantime, the Crusaders accepted installments with good manners. Winter under the walls teaches patience. Snow considers domes a canvas. Horses grow thoughtful. Negotiations develop hobbies. The new emperor found that miracles, especially financial ones, prefer long notice. Constantinople was a city of accounts and hesitations. It could promise golden futures in as many languages as it had neighborhoods, but cash preferred to walk. Supplies came, then slowed, then came again in that distracted rhythm cities use when they mean well. Meanwhile, Venice kept a hand on the rudder of events with the delicacy of a surgeon who also sells bandages. Dandolo, old enough to be considered ageless, stood in council like a well-cut mess would, history and gravity cooperating. In the cold fog that rises off the water and insists on being poetry, the Crusade waited. Waiting is a tactic, if you squint. What held the coalition together was not swagger, but bookkeeping. Debts age at anchor faster than they do at sea. Interest, unlike the weather, never sleeps. From pledge to plunder is a road paved with invoices. As the spring loosened ropes and people remembered optimism, the treasury inside the walls could not keep pace with the promises it had obliged itself to admire. Negotiations frayed like garrison ropes. The city rioted in little daily ways that left ash where patience had been. Alexius IV discovered that loyalty runs on fuel, and so does government. When his enemies within promoted another emperor, people in the camps looked toward Venice the way a classroom looks toward the teacher when the diagram begins to wobble. The Crusade had arrived to restore an order. It found itself explaining order's cost. Enforcement, in a devotional context, acquired siege engines. Then came the ledger's correction, tallied in smoke. The walls, which had looked like an essay on permanence, accepted ladders. Breaches opened like footnotes. On water, a maneuver unfolded that would later be described with hand gestures and admiration. Venetian galleys lashed themselves to the sea walls and turned masts into bridges. A trick both audacious and oddly administrative. When the door is locked, file through the window. Fires wandered the city in purposeful lines. Bells rang until their clappers remembered other careers. Relics moved from altars to inventory lists, the sound a chapel makes when it becomes a storeroom. 3 days seems a small unit of time for a capital to change owners, but time is elastic when contracts come due. On the third day, the arithmetic settled. The Crusade, astonishing itself only a little, had collected collateral in kind. If this were an epic told to keep the children awake, we would roll drums. But the story is gentler than that, more like the slow creak of an account book being closed. A great city had been converted to credit. Chalices became coin with surprising politeness. Bronze horses considered a holiday they would take and then forgot to come back. Clerks wrote lists in a hand so tidy you could sleep on it. The partition of wealth was conducted with the kind of efficiency that Venice could summarize in a chart. There were lots for quarters, lots for jewels, lots for the odd things empires keep in cupboards. Everyone who had endured the winter found something to carry away, even if it was only a story about a marble street that sighed when carts rolled by. The Crusades' vow, if measured strictly, lay bankrupt. The ledger, if measured practically, gleamed. Out of the ruins, as people like to say when they are being brisk, somebody proposed an empire. It was a solution drawn on paper first, the way architects heal a city by sketching walls in the margins. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was one of those political inventions that are held up by keys rather than customs. Its palaces were damp with recent history. Its throne had paperwork. Its frontiers were made of opinions. Trade quarters became crusader camps. Customs posts, with their quiet insistence on small sums and stamped wax, replaced the older currency of penances and trumpets. The sea lanes, which always vote with their currents, declared for Venice. The West kept the story because the West had better copyists. In this rearrangement, Jerusalem slipped to the edge of the page, like a subject you still mean to return to once the house is in order. There is a kind of crown that is heavy in sermons and light in practice. The Latin emperors wore that kind. Their charters could be copied neatly. Their garrisons solved problems as long as the problems arrived in straight lines. Their festivals did their best with confetti made of languages. The new rhythm of the city became tariffs and treaties, with occasional arguments about saints' bones that could be priced per ounce. Venice positioned itself like a hinge, opening and closing markets, collecting fees with the relaxed efficiency of a tide. Across the harbors, ships rocked as if nodding to an old friend. The Crusades' future shrank to fit a parchment that could be rolled and tied with ribbon, valuable because it reduced chaos to a bill. A bedtime verdict on price and promise arrives without applause. What debt touched, it steered. What it steered, it renamed. What it renamed, it excused. The sack of 1204 has been rehearsed many times with more thunder, but the quieter truth is that the expedition became a kind of traveling balance sheet. Cities are stubborn. Constantinople kept its scars and then made them decorative. The West kept a story that explained how piety had found a colleague in practicality. Some called it a tragedy, others a transaction. The ledgers accepted both words with equal courtesy. If sin was once tallied in confessionals, 1204 suggested an alternative desk with better lighting. Now the gulls wheel over abandoned fortifications that have decided to be picturesque, and oars that once counted miles like coins are long since dust under warehouses that count different things. The arsenal's hammers slowed, sped up, and learned steam. The Doge's palace kept its corners straight. The bronze horses took a long vacation and then returned with different opinions. History smoothed its pages. What remains is the soft lesson a sleepy mind can keep. When a crusade sold its soul, it asked for a receipt. The receipt said paid in part, shipped to another dress, balance due upon circumstances. And if you drift now between one sentence and the quiet that follows it, you may hear the faint creak of a contract drying in the sea air, the sigh of a city that has been many kinds of capital, and the water, which has never cared about ledgers, moving under hulls that forgot their own names a long time ago. You might not expect the history of the pencil to involve seaweed, sheep, and a French officer short on gunpowder, but there they are, lined up like obedient stationery on a neat desk. The pencil sits so calmly that it tricks us into believing it was always simple, always yellow, always ready to draw a line and keep quiet about it. It was not. For a long time, people wrote with things that stained accidentally smoke on bone, soot and gum, metal that left a pale trail like a snail that had attended finishing school. Then, one rainy century in the north of England, a hillside casually coughed up a seam of ultra-pure graphite, and the story ambled forward at a decidedly pencil-like pace. If you re-still awake by the time I compare a carpenter's pencil to a loaf of bread, you can subscribe for more stories where nothing urgent happens. But the pillow has seniority here, so truly do whatever is easiest for your eyelids. The Bardale deposit in Cumbria was tidy in a British sort of way. The graphite was so pure you could almost saw it into slices, which someone very sensibly did. Shepherds noticed first because shepherds notice most things. They used pieces to mark sheep with temporary dark coats, a tradition of pastoral cosmetics that probably did not survive many storms. Locals wrapped the brittle slabs in string or sheepskin and discovered an agreeable paradox: a rock that behaved like ink. The government eventually realized that this rock was useful for cannonballs. The molds adored it, so the crown treated the mine like an unassuming dragon horde, guarded by laws, fences, and a sense of secrecy that fooled precisely no one. Smugglers pocketed small fortunes in the form of quiet gray crumbs. Somewhere, a clerk wrote the world's most underwhelming arrest report, confiscated one dirty pocket. Contents, promising. Graphite is not lead, though everyone called it that. Possibly because plumbago sounded like a sea creature, and blacklead at least had the dignity of error. Medieval scribes had used actual lead styluses that left dignified. Faint lines perfect for ruling pages, unsatisfactory for declaring love or complaining about taxes. The Baradale material, carbon arranged in extremely polite sheets, slid across paper like a skater who only knows one move but performs it perfectly. The problem was fragility. You could pinch a stick and end up with an essay's worth of powder in your hand. So carpenters planed cedar into slender coffins and tucked the graphite inside, sometimes gluing two thin wooden halves like a sandwich designed by a minimalist. In Italy, workshops in Bologna and later in the Val di Chianti smoothed the craft. In Nuremberg, the Faber family opened a cupboard, put the century inside, and labeled it pencils. They were still expensive, still prone to unfortunate snapping, and still morally suspicious in certain circles. Anything that allowed quick revision aroused theological misgivings. Yet the pencil acquired the greatest recommendation available in human history. It was handy. It smudged in a friendly way. It could be sharpened with whatever blade you already resented for being dull. It did not freeze, clog, or ask for sand to blot it. It was the writing equivalent of a neighbor who waters your plants unasked and keeps leaving you zucchini. Then France ran short of war supplies, as large countries sometimes do when the century forgets its manners. During the 1790s, Napoleon's armies needed cartridges, mathematicians, and probably pencils. The English graphite trade was difficult to access when one's navy was occupied elsewhere, so a resourceful officer named Nicolas Jacques Conte stirred powdered graphite into clay, shaped the paste into thin sticks, and fired them in a kiln until chemistry happened. This is still the basic recipe for modern pencil lead: carbon made extroverted by heat and adjusted for personality by clay. Vary the clay to graphite ratio and the line changes complexion. More clay yields a harder, paler mark. More graphite gives a softer, darker mood, prone to romance and smudges. It was the first time in writing history that you could manufacture shades of confidence to order. The miracle was not one dramatic discovery, but a patient tuning. Temperature, particle size, binders, and the soft diplomacy of water. Conte's method also freed pencils from the geological fate of Baradale. You can make a respectable pencil from humbler graphite, provided you listen to the kill like a baker listening to bread. Grading followed like an excessively organized friend. In Europe, letters describe temperament: H for hard, B for black, F for fine point, with our old acquaintance HB hovering right in the middle like a compromise that turned out to be a philosophy. Across the Atlantic, numbers did the job, and number 2 became the comfortable standard by a process equal parts marketing and examination form logistics. There is no deeper mystery in number 2 than your favorite pair of socks. It simply fits. It presses into paper just enough to be legible under the unimpressed eye of a Scantron machine, but not so boldly that it performs. Some workshop ledger surely contains the first argument over whether HB equals number 2. Somewhere else, at exactly the same hour, 2 artisans debated the ideal cedar scent for a pencil shaving. This is how civilization advances, by parallel, quietly passionate disagreements about very small things that enormously improve our mornings. Meanwhile, wood itself agreed to cooperate. Cedars of the western United States, Cholocedrus decurrens. If you like your lullabies, botanical offered straight grain, easy sharpening, and the fragrance that made even arithmetic feel outdoorsy. Factories sliced logs into pencil slats and milled long grooves that looked like very small train tracks. Lead was laid, glue was introduced with solemn ceremony, and a second slat was pressed on top, creating what industry folks, who are more whimsical than we give them credit for, call a pencil sandwich. The sandwiches were then sliced into individual pencils and rounded or hexed into shape. The hexagon is not just an aesthetic. It keeps the pencil from rolling off a desk and performing its only party trick on the floor. A round pencil, which looks friendlier, tends to demonstrate gravity at inconvenient moments. The humble ferrule, the metal cuff that hugs the eraser, began as sheet brass rolled into tiny sleeves, sometimes crimped decoratively, sometimes plain, always a bit proud of its tight embrace. And the eraser itself, made from vulcanized rubber, after Charles Goodyear taught rubber to behave, turned the pencil into a reversible sentence. You could write, sigh, and reconsider. The moralists were not entirely wrong. Erasability changes how we think. The pencil's mercy is a quiet revolution performed in a whisper. A curious habit settled over the 19th century. People chose pencil colors the way nations choose flags. In the United States, the yellow pencil became king after American manufacturers began importing fine graphite from Siberia, a place synonymous in the popular imagination with both exile and mineral competence. To advertise the luxury of foreign graphite, firms painted pencils bright yellow, a color thought to signal imperial quality because the Chinese emperors liked yellow, or because it was visible when lost under paperwork. Sources disagree in a drowsy way. The shade stuck. Today, rows of yellow pencils in a classroom look like a field of upright sunbeams, each with a pink eraser like a soft cap. Somewhere out there is a historian whose specialty is why school supplies have the colors they do, and I hope they have a very comfortable chair. Mechanisms crept in with the slow excitement of a technical manual. The mechanical pencil, which is simply a pencil that decided to become a machine, appeared in enough forms to entertain a patient locksmith. Early versions were clever but moody. Modern ones settled on propelling thin rods of polymer-bonded graphite through jaws that grip and release with an agreeable click. Lead diameters formed their own polite society. 0.3 millimeters for hair's breadth lines, 0.5 millimeters for the practical daily. Sentence 0.7 millimeters for those who press and prefer forgiveness, 0.9 millimeters for people who like to draw maps and not sharpen axles. Engineers standardized these sizes so that we could lose a pencil and borrow another without rewriting the concept of a circle. The word lead continued to follow along, a friendly misnomer that refused to be corrected. Even mistakes, the pencil reminds us, can be useful if they are consistent. Somewhere in this long quiet, a factory foreman became the first person to be paid for grading darkness. One can imagine the test, lines drawn in sequence like a shy zebra, each mark judged not for beauty, but for obedient shade. The pencil world attracted other extremely specific expertise. There were cedar buyers who could smell a plank and tell you its mood. There were ferrule press operators who nailed the exact pressure between two loose erasers wandering off like impatient hats, and too tight erasers strangled into silence. There were the eraser compound mixers who discovered that a trace of pumice adds just enough tooth to lift graphite while keeping paper politely alive. People think industry is noisy. Often it is just careful. The dull thud of a stamping press becomes a lullaby when it runs correctly for an hour. The hum of a kill is a cat that never quite sleeps. The pencil's social life widened at this unruffled pace. Artists found in it a tool that keeps secrets until asked, then reveals tone by tone with a diplomacy no paintbrush can match. Architects practiced a controlled confidence in HB. Animators learned to make first passes in blue so the camera would ignore their early thoughts. Crossword puzzlers declared to be too bold, unless they carried a very soft kneaded eraser like a traveling cloud. Carpenters loved flat, rectangular pencils because they don't roll on roofs and can be planed into a chisel for marking across grain. A carpenter's pocket is a museum of practical geometry where the pencil is the docent. Golfers tuck short pencils into small holders as if they were notes for a musical score where all the melodies are numbers. The pencil attends all these activities with the same expression: present, undecided, forgiving. On the other side of the desk, an office culture evolved that can be measured by the species of sharpener in residence. There is the handheld wedge, democratic and direct, that fills the palm with cedar curls like tiny cinnamon rolls. There is the heavy crank sharpener, bolted to a classroom wall, which devours a pencil with theatrical commitment and leaves a point so sharp it worries about its own future. There are electric sharpeners that whir like polite bees. There's, too, the pocket knife, which believes all tools should survive on their wits. Each method whispers its own values. The wedge says, "We have time." The crank says, "We have 30 students." The knife says, "We have a fence to build, and this is how my grandfather did it." The electric sharpener says, "Please keep your fingers outside the mouth of progress." Every one of them returns the pencil to its calling with a small ceremony and shavings. There's, quietly, economy to consider. A pencil teaches thrift by design. It works until it can't be held, a slow disappearing act with measurable dignity. Manufacturers experimented with little metal extenders and clever sleeves so you could use the last stub. In countries where import restrictions or thrift encouraged ingenuity, families saved the stubs in jars, the way one saves buttons, the domestic archaeology of usefulness. Teachers, who understand time better than anyone, learn to estimate an exam by the number of pencils consumed. There is perhaps a spreadsheet somewhere labeled average graphite expenditure per semester, and it is a document that absolutely should be laminated. The pencil even brushed against modernity's brief flirtation with decimal time. During the French Revolution, for 12 energetic months, the day was divided into 10 hours, each with 100 minutes. This did not last. People suspected rightly that the sun had not been consulted. But for that year, a pencil in Paris could have drawn a timetable with 10-hour days and been technically correct. It is a small fact, mildly absurd, exactly suited to a bedtime brain. The lines that scheduled a baker's work could have been labeled 3.75 o'clock with a straight face. The pencil's quiet diplomacy extended into science, where field notebooks grow soggy and keyboards pretend to be immortal. On an Antarctic sled, a pencil will write where ink sulks and batteries stage a sit-in. On a spacecraft, one imagines the argument that led to grease pencils and Velcro straps, the engineering joke that never ends. What does not break when it falls? Answer: something without moving parts. Botanists in rainforests, geologists on scree, archaeologists in small pits, reimagining enormous palaces, all of them tuck a pencil behind the ear and look more trustworthy for it. The tool can be sterilized by erasing what it has just written. It carries no pride. You can lend it and still have a story. Paint manufacturers and marketing departments eventually polished the pencil into an object that could be ceremonially purchased. Metallic finishes, imprinted slogans, limited editions that celebrate cities, films, and causes. There are boutique pencils that take themselves seriously and deserve to. There are novelty pencils as long as your arm, unable to fit anyone's hand, bought in museums by tired parents for delighted children. Yet in a drawer not far from any of these lies the pencil of daily bread. Yellow, number 2, hexagonal, eraser slightly askew, ferrule a little dented by thought. In most homes there is a place, often a mug once used for something else, where these anonymous citizens congregate. They come from conferences, hotels, the bottom of backpacks, and the uncharted inland seas of kitchen counters. They lean together like citizens waiting for a bus, and anyone can adopt one without paperwork. We can, if we like, try to time the life of a pencil. Estimates vary. Some say that a standard HB writes around 45,000 words, which is roughly a small novel, or a semester of notes in a class where the professor likes to repeat himself. Others calculate miles of line around 35. A charming statistic if you are planning to draw the world's longest ruler. None of these numbers will help you sleep, but their very existence is soothing. Someone cared enough to count. A pencil responds by not caring at all. It will cheerfully scribble shopping lists, check crossword boxes, shade apples until they resemble planets, and teach a 6-year-old the letter S, which always looks like it's about to slip off the page and nap. When do we reach the end of a pencil? The best answer is never quite, because even the stump can be promoted to dignity. Artists glue their favorite nubs together like graphitic mosaics. Pencil extenders, those short wooden sleeves with metal clamps, rescue stubs from purgatory. There are people who collect the tiny rubber caps that prolong erasers, each cap shaped like the hat of a very small, very determined official. There are also people who will sharpen a pencil down to a tragic needle and then save the shavings, because the shavings are beautiful spirals, and a day should not be allowed to pass without at least one spiral. Beauty has always been a side effect of usefulness. If you turn a pencil in your fingers now, watch the grain run like a river that never bothers to flood. The lacquer may be chipped. The brand name might announce itself with pride or apology. The eraser bears the history of your reconsiderations, a pale coral worn into a courteous slope. Look closely and you will see the seam where the two slats were glued, a tiny line of union that keeps the graphite safe. Under the lacquer, under the cedar, under the clay, the carbon itself is a layered arrangement of atoms that prefer sliding to sticking. It is polite to paper because it is polite to itself. There is something restful in that. You might not expect all this from an object that costs less than a bus ride. Yet here it is, modest and quietly Baroque. It has survived revolutions, school reforms, artistic movements, office reorganizations, and that one time you tried to open a package with it and snap the point. It forgave you instantly. Somewhere a shepherd marks a lamb with a quick line that will wash away in the rain. Somewhere a student erases a sentence and starts again. Somewhere a surveyor in the 19th century tests a chain length and notes the result in graphite that is still dark today. Somewhere you, perhaps, are not asleep yet, which is perfectly all right. You could imagine the faint rasp of a pencil on paper, the way the sound gathers at the edges like a friendly breeze. You could think about how the line keeps going, softly, as long as your hand is willing and the cedar allows. Or you could simply leave the pencil where it lies and let the shavings of history curl in on themselves, quiet as a drawer closing, gentle as a page turned by a breath you didn't know you'd taken. You might not expect the world to have argued for centuries about the size of a teaspoon, but it did, and quite calmly, the way kitchen drawers argue when no one is looking. The teaspoon is a small promise of measurement that tried to be both social and scientific, both for stirring and for counting, and that took an unhurried clinking journey from polite drawing rooms to laboratory benches and back to the sugar bowl. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe for more quiet disputes about containers. Or do nothing at all and let the pillow win by forfeit. There's no leaderboard here, only teaspoons, which sit in their slots like well-behaved commas. The earliest ancestors of the teaspoon were not born as spoons at all, but as guesses. People measured a spoonful of salt before they measured 5 milliliters, and it worked because kitchens are forgiving places that prefer dinner to precision. Medieval apothecaries, being less forgiving, used drams and scruples, which sound like moods, but were actually weights for powders that did something to you if the spoons were wrong. A scruple was 20 grains, a grain was a barley corn, and a barley corn was conveniently the size of a barley corn, except on rainy days when the field had opinions. It is soothing to imagine a clerk weighing barley grains one by one, evening out a scruple while a patient customer watched the balance bob like a small boat. Somewhere around the 17th century, tea arrived politely in Europe, and with it, a social ritual that liked small spoons. A teaspoon was originally just that, the spoon that kept company with tea, slender, decorative, better at conversation than work. You could stir politely and feel the handle hum against porcelain, the clink that is practically a lullaby. But once the word existed, it attracted numbers. Recipes began to multiply after the printing press decided it liked dinner. Early cookbooks mentioned spoonfuls with a charming vagueness that told you how much experience the author expected you to have. Slowly, teaspoons stepped forward as a unit, trying on different hats in different countries and not minding overmuch when the hats fit differently. In Britain, a teaspoon lived in a neighborhood of dessert spoons and tablespoons. In the United States, it had neighbors called cups and pints who often shouted across the fence about biscuits. Conversion charts were drawn by people who went to bed early. By the 19th century, measuring spoons started to visit middle-class kitchens, and the teaspoon had to decide if it was a host or a ruler. Some makers stamped teaspoon on the handle and left the matter at that, as if a word could prevent disagreement. Others offered nested sets with small rings, labeling each bowl with numbers that looked confident even when the spoons, sitting next to egg cups, suspected that all eggs were different. Meanwhile, the word teaspoon wandered into literature and found it liked metaphors as well as sugar. Poets measured out their lives with them. Diarists measured out their mornings. A polite insult could be served with one. The teaspoon, it turns out, understood volume and atmosphere. It also understood the quiet panic of cough mixtures a teaspoon before bed. Not a tablespoon, please, and mothers in nightgowns moved carefully through dim kitchens, performing pharmacy with flatware. Apothecaries and physicians noticed the ambiguity and frowned in professional italics. In 1876, the British Pharmacopoeia gave numbers to the teaspoon and tablespoon for medicines, treating the home as a small clinic that deserved reliable arithmetic. Across the Atlantic, American physicians suggested that 1 teaspoon should be approximately 60 minims, which sounds exact until you remember that minims were defined by drops, and drops are defined by whether they feel like it. A chemist at a desk somewhere, lit by a window that did not open quite right, wrote conversions between household. An apothecary measures and wondered if a teaspoon ever really wanted this much attention. It is comforting to think the spoon answered by glinting. Parallel to medicine, factories quietly standardized how spoons were born. Sheffield and Zollingen handled steel. Electroplating turned base metals into polite company. Stainless alloys learned to keep their shine through sinkfuls of suds. Pattern books became fashion catalogs for cutlery, fiddle, kings, shell, Old English, and styles that make even soup seem ceremonial. The teaspoon kept its traditional silhouette oval bowl, slender neck, handle for holding, but its weight in the hand became a signature. A hotel teaspoon is heavier than a souvenir spoon for obvious reasons. Hotels do not like their spoons to run away. Airline teaspoons were shorter, not only to fit the tray table, but to remind you that clouds prefer small gestures. Somewhere in an industrial office, someone measured the bend strength of tiny handles so a scoop of ice cream would not win. All this engineering ensured that when the teaspoon pretended to be a measuring device, it had earned the right to pretend convincingly. The 20th century tried to sort the vocabulary. In Britain, metrication committees calmly moved through schools and shops, explaining that a teaspoon used for recipes would now mean 5 milliliters, a tablespoon 15, and the living room would remain an imperial because the tea set had seniority. In the United States, cookbooks spread the gospel that 3 teaspoons make a tablespoon, a doctrine earlier than many marriages, while medicine gradually moved to milliliters, honoring syringes and safety caps. The World Health Organization and national health agencies warned that household spoons were inconsistent, a phrase which is both true and perfectly obvious to anyone who has opened a junk drawer. If you have ever used a souvenir teaspoon shaped like a lighthouse, you know that accuracy has many enemies. Even so, the home kitchen stubborn, affectionate kept its teaspoons. Measuring spoons, stamped with 5 ml, settled into nests, held together by rings that enjoy becoming sticky. Cookware catalogs offered sets in seashell colors. Camping stores offered folding titanium versions that look like equipment for politely eating asteroids. And the teaspoon remained itself, still good for stirring, still willing to carry a precise 5 milliliters if you help by leveling it with a knife. Leveling became a minor philosophy. Cookbooks explain the difference between heaping and level, as if the spoon were a mountain. Baking teachers showed the graceful swipe of a straight edge across the top, a small horizon in the bowl of a spoon, a gesture that makes kitchens feel more like clinics and yet not less friendly. Salt taught us humility. A heaping teaspoon of table salt is heavier than a heaping teaspoon of kosher salt because crystals express themselves differently. Spoons cannot solve this. They are tiny stages, and the actors, powders, grains, liquids perform in their own costumes. Flour packs itself down like a shy crowd. Sugar pours like confetti. Some people weigh ingredients now, confident and late to dinner. Others remain faithful to the spoon because the spoon remembers their grandmother and the pancakes never complained. Precision in a kitchen is really a conversation with heat, and the teaspoon speaks just loudly enough to be heard by butter. Spoon design also drifted into micro-innovations that could put the most alert person to sleep. Some manufacturers offered double-ended measuring spoons, one round side for liquids, one narrow side for spice jars that are never quite wide enough. Magnetic sets arrived, so that spoons stacked in drawers like well-behaved cards. The handles received gentle curves for scraping. The bowls were made oval or oblong to pass through small lids. The engraving switched to laser so dishwashers would not persuade the numbers to fade. Stainless steel came in various tempers 18/10, being a favorite for resisting corrosion and sounding, when tapped, like a faraway bell. Plastic spoons offered cheerful colors and a certain lightness, though they sometimes learned humility in contact with turmeric. In all this, the teaspoon watched, amused, still stirring tea, still being borrowed to tighten small screws when the house could not find a screwdriver, a moonlighting gig it performs with contradiction. The bowl is wrong, but the handle is right. Yet the teaspoon's most patient work may be linguistic. It holds idioms the way it holds syrup. In kitchens and novels, a teaspoon of patience means almost none. A teaspoon of courage means just enough. Hospital instructions turn to milliliters, but people still say a spoonful, as if language had chosen comfort over calibration. In international standards, there is even an official teaspoon for tea tasting, with a rounder bowl to collect the liquor, and there is ISO 3103, the British standard method for brewing tea to test its quality, not a bedtime story, and yet gently soporific teapots preheated. 2 grams per 100 milliliters, 6 minutes of infusion, milk optional, and carefully recorded. Imagine a row of tasters, each with a cup and a spoon, slurping politely to aerate the sip, cleansing the spoon in a bowl of hot water, everything recorded, no one hurried. Precision can be as calming as any lullaby when it behaves. Museums, meanwhile, house teaspoons with biographies, commemorative spoons bearing dates of royal visits, designs featuring city skylines as if coffee needed geography, little enamel shields clinging to handles like determined lapel pins. There are spoons that commemorate world's fairs, spoons that remember railways, spoons with holes advertised as slotted, and with the purest confidence that someone will know why. There are antique sugar spoons, slightly larger cousins with scalloped bowls like tiny shells, reminding us that sugar once arrived in loaves and needed tongs, chisels, and a relationship with time. There are demitasse spoons for espresso, gloriously superfluous stirrers for drinks measured in thimbles, bar spoons with twisting stems that suggest chemistry and mischief, long-handled parfait spoons for chasing strawberries through tall glasses that make every dessert feel like architecture. Each of these shares a genealogy with the teaspoon, as if the flatware drawer were a family reunion where everyone can see the resemblance. Medicine kept adjusting its instructions, perhaps because sleep is welcome but dosing errors are not. Syringes marked in milliliters replace teaspoon on labels, and yet parents still keep spoons for the ceremony of medicine. The way you might keep a nightlight even when the hallway is perfectly navigable. Public health campaigns gently begged people to use dosing devices and not whatever spoon came to hand after the dishwasher decided to be full again. A study would appear now and then, noting that household teaspoons range from 3 to 7 milliliters, and that the human tendency to prefer heaping when anxious was unhelpful. The teaspoon nodded, but did not resign. It knows where the honey is. Airlines, at their calmest, created teaspoons that hid inside galley drawers like secrets. Metal ones were collected enthusiastically by passengers in decades when souvenir ethics were foggier. Plastic ones came and went with the price of oil and the mood of the cabin. Somewhere, a logistics manager knows exactly how many teaspoons circle the planet at 36,000 feet. Cruise lines prefer spoons that feel like small anchors because a rolling ship likes to argue with your saucer. Cafes engrave their logos into handles as if to remind cappuccinos where they were born. At office kitchens, the teaspoons migrate mysteriously between floors, perhaps to consult with colleagues near the microwave. Lost spoons accumulate in desk drawers with paper clips and the pen that writes only on forms. Spoons are not lost. They are redistributed. If spoons have enemies, they are two, dishwashers and drains. Dishwasher baskets seem to practice minimal containment, and teaspoons slip through to rattle against the heating element in a noise that imitates a tiny blacksmith. Drains have great space, just far enough apart to accept a spoon if the day needs drama. Both adversaries can be defeated by baskets with smaller holes, strainers with ambitions, and a habit of counting to 12. A household that knows it owns 12 teaspoons but can find only 9 experiences, a moral that philosophers have been trying to state for centuries. Inventory is a feeling. To counter this, some households adopt a spoon jar by the kettle, refilled at intervals like a municipal fountain. The jar is a barometer of company. It empties in proportion to conversation. Metrication continues its patient walk. In recipes, 5 milliliters is now printed almost as frequently as its spoon translation. Laboratories have never looked back. They live in milliliters and volumes that precisely pretend to be cubes. Cocktail recipes write 5 milliliters with the same nonchalance as a dash. And yet the teaspoon still appears because the human hand understands it without thinking. It is the unit that lives between finger and thumb, the unit that knows where your pulse is. That intimacy is hard to retire. Even industrial kitchens that weigh nearly everything keep spoons around for tasting, stirring, and small rescues no one thinks to write down. In the quiet of night, when a kitchen is just a moonlit geometry of counters and shining appliances, a row of teaspoons in a drawer makes a soft metal chorus when moved. The bowls nest, one within another, like little ponds agreeing to share a shoreline. If you lift one, it is cool and certain. Imagine the path it has taken, ore to steel, steel to strip, strip to spoon, stamped in a press that buds like a heartbeat, polished, boxed, shipped, unboxed, washed, and put to work. Imagine the sugar it has carried, the lemon juice, the cough syrup, the medicine that became a habit and then became a memory. Imagine the accidental uses, prying lids, rescuing olive pits, turning screws, defeating the last stubborn corner of a pudding. Teaspoons are not heroic, they are persistent. There is a theory that civilization is a slow agreement about small things. The teaspoon is one of those things. It learned to be 5 milliliters not by decree alone, but by the steady practice of cooks, nurses, manufacturers, and anyone who preferred their tea sweet today the same way it was sweet yesterday. The teaspoon knows that most of life is stirred, not shaken, and that an exact measure whispered into hot water is a more durable technology than many loud inventions. It also knows how to hide, how to roll under a toaster, how to reappear just when you have discovered the teaspoon-sized spot in your day that needs filling. If at this hour you are halfway to sleep, you might picture a teaspoon resting on a saucer, a small moon laying down its reflection. The tea stops swirling. The handle cools. The kitchen clock counts to 5 milliliters again and again, and nothing in the drawer minds. You might not expect a quiet loop of wire to have a passport, a love life, and a long argument with drawers, but the paperclip does, and it prefers an aisle seat. If you're still awake in a few minutes, feel free to subscribe for more bedtime stationery. Or let the screen dim and the mind fold neatly by itself, which is, in a way, the most elegant filing system. The paperclip story is unhurried. It begins with a straight piece of wire, which is already most of the journey, and then a decision to bend, which is the rest. It is brave in the smallest possible way, the way a coat hanger is brave when it volunteers to become a television antenna. Long before anyone called it a paperclip, clerks typed papers with ribbon, stabbed them with pins, or used wax seals that treated correspondence like tiny treaties. Pins worked most days, though the pens did not apologize to fingers, and the paperwork developed an interesting topography. At some point in the 19th century, industries discovered tough, springy steel wire and decided this should hold more than fences. Wire could remember its shape, a kind of patience that felt almost moral. Factories pulled steel rods through dies until they were thinner than a pencil line. On a quiet afternoon, you might imagine the wire making a soft violin note as it passed. The wire had a nickname, piano wire, because it shared temperament with strings that had ambitions to sing. Paper, which is famously social, invited the wire to stay. Designers tried many shapes. The catalogs are a low hum of options. The fake clip that pinches like a bird beak. The right clip that looks like a cartoon wave. The owl clip with mild eyebrows. The Niagara with decorative ripples. And the butterfly clip, which is honest about its prettiness. But the most familiar outline, an oblong with 2 loops, one sitting comfortably inside the other, became the quiet sovereign. In English, it is called the gem, which is unintentionally charming, like naming your best sock Diamond. The gem's patent paperwork is a puzzle. Some claim it was never patented as such, merely manufactured by the gem manufacturing company and allowed to win by persistence. Others point to similar drawings, like a family portrait, where everyone has the same smile. What matters is that the gem solved a problem without fuss. It slid on without puncturing, slid off without complaint, held with the cooperation of friction and optimism, and could be shaken gently without losing its dignity. If it fell, it did so in a way that made the fall your fault, which is a rare feature in office supplies. Wire has measurements that are drowsy to recite. A typical paperclip uses steel wire about 1 millimeter thick, sometimes a little less, sometimes coated with zinc to resist rust, sometimes with plastic in cheerful colors that fade only if the decade insists. The standard length hovers around 33 millimeters, which is almost exactly the distance between an intention and a decision, and is long enough to hide under a keyboard. The ends are usually rounded to avoid scolding the paper. A few manufacturers cut them square, a decision they defend bravely, possibly because round cutters were busy that week. The outer loop creates a little spring. The inner loop pushes back. In engineering terms, the clip is a torsion bar with ideas about manners. When you slide it on, you are bending paper and metal very slightly, asking each to make room for the other. It is a handshake performed twice. In different languages, the paperclip borrows gentle metaphors. In French, it is a trombone, which explains why you occasionally see a symphony tucked into a folder. In Norwegian, it is binders, which sounds practical and a little stern, as if the clip is a schoolmaster with chalk on his sleeve. In German, it is Büroklammer, the office clamp, which correctly identifies both the habitat and the hobby. The object's behavior is identical across these dialects. It insists on being helpful and small. Accountants leaned on it during winters of ink and columns. Librarians adopted it with caution and then with love. Letter writers kept them in small dishes that collected dust, coins, and thumbtacks, forming the minor geology of a desk. The paperclip is not new enough to be fashionable and not old enough to be antique. It is instead unavoidable, which is often the same as essential. Factories did not just make paperclips. They taught them the cue. Wire unspooled into a machine that bent it around pegs the way a finger curls hair. 1, 2, 3, 4 turns, and then snipped, a heartbeat in metal. The clips tumbled like silver noodles and were sorted by a shaking tray with holes, a lullaby in industrial tempo. Some were electroplated in a bath that smelled awake. Others were tumbled with porcelain beads to smooth their edges. The colored ones took their coats like small city buses receiving advertisements. A box of 100 weighed less than a novel. The boxes stacked into cartons. Cartons into palletized rectangles. Rectangles into warehouses that taught forklifts to move with quiet dignity. Somewhere a procurement officer wrote down a number that meant enough clips for the quarter, which is how an infinite supply is made, on purpose, slowly. The clip acquired a talent for symbolism by accident. During the Second World War in Norway, wearing a paper clip on a lapel became a polite act of resistance medal bent into loyalty. It meant, more or less, that loose pages could be held together, but so could other things. The object had no right to carry meaning this confidently, but it did, because small things are hard to confiscate and easy to share. Later, an American software assistant appeared on screens with the shape of a cheerful clip and an appetite for commentary. The assistant was well-meant in the way an enthusiastic neighbor is well-meant when he knocks to say your porch light is on. Both the character and the office staple survived. Only one retired permanently. The paperclip also became a currency of attention in classrooms' chain-making competitions that snaked across bulletin boards, red, blue, yellow links forming quiet rainbows. There's probably still a chain under at least one school radiator that no custodian has bothered to remove out of respect or inertia. When clips fail, their failures are educational. A stack thick with optimism will ask a single clip to dream beyond its capacity. It will hold for 3 seconds, 5, settle, and then sigh its way off the corner. The paper remembers the attempt in a little curl, like a cowlick. Humidity confuses everything. Plastic-coated clips grip gently, but lack the bite of bare steel. Bare steel complains to wet air. A rusted clip can write a ghostly half-moon on the first sheet, a punctuation mark for negligence. If you twist a clip into a pick for a phone SIM tray, it will perform heroically once and then blame you forever. The clip was designed to hold 2 planes together. It forgives many other uses but does not thrive on them. It will, however, cheerfully bookmark a page, unlock a public bathroom door if the day insists, reset a router's hidden button, tie back a houseplant's wandering stem, repair a zipper at a picnic, and rescue a crumb from a stubborn corner of a toaster that believes in privacy. It has the work ethic of a Boy Scout badge and the memory of a goldfish. Each bend you impose is one less bend it wishes to survive. You can feel, in your fingertips, the moment the temper gives up. That moment is a kind of ethics lesson. Everything useful has limits, including your patience. Not every culture settled on the same favorite shape. The gem dominates, but in parts of Eastern Europe, a clip with an extra small loop is common, like a flourish on a signature. In 1899, a U.S. patent described a design with straight parallel sides, which holds very firmly if you do not mind your papers looking like they were printed on corrugated cardboard. There are triangular clips that stack without tangling in a junk drawer, a virtue so overwhelming that you still will not buy them. Plastic clips molded as 2-pronged U-shapes promise not to rust and keep that promise conspicuously. There are binder clips, which are not paper clips, though the word clip borders their yard. These are little black bulldogs that hold thick stacks with the blunt confidence of a small business. with paperclip as a cat by comparison. It occupies the corner of your document and purrs. The two coexist. The binder clip can even carry a paperclip on its silver ears like jewelry. Offices have their own ecology. A file cabinet is a city for paperclips. Imagine a drawer sliding, smelling faintly of paper dust and toner, revealing folders, each with a clip poised like a crescent moon on the top left corner. The clips wait for meetings to end. They will be carried to tables, returned to drawers, promoted to archival boxes, demoted to the recycling bin, separated by magnet, counted by no one. In digital times, they still survive because paper survives forms, contracts, comfort printouts for people who think better with a pen. The paperclip has no resentment toward the PDF. It knows that everything eventually needs a shelf. Meanwhile, the paperclip finds new roles near screens. It cleans crumbs from keyboard seams, holds a cable in place with tape, marks a yes on a postcard with a metallic sigh. It never demands an update. The only patch you apply is a finger swipe to wipe off graphite. Curiously, the paperclip has a talent for chaos as well as order. Pour a jar of clips onto a table and they interlock immediately, practicing the social behavior never taught in school. You can shake the pile gently and form chains without trying. The physics of small hooks does the work. This is both delightful and inconvenient. Manufacturers sell boxes with non-skid paper clips that wear microscopic ridges to reduce the interlocking. They do not, of course, stop entirely. Interlocking is a hobby like chess in a park. The clips will return to it whenever you are not looking. People have built sculptures from them, towers, spheres, hearts. There are Guinness records for longest paperclip chain. Tens of kilometers assembled by patient hands that preferred monotony to weather. A chain of 50 feels long when you are procrastinating. A chain of 10,000 becomes a lesson in municipal planning. Most sculptures end the same way. Someone needs the clips for their original purpose, and the art is donated back to its native drawer. Standards organizations have opinions about paper clips, but they state them politely. A British standard from the mid-20th century suggested dimensions for no 1, no 3, and giant, which is a thrilling name for a device you can lose under a magazine. The diameters of wire, length of loop, preferred coatings, these are written down so quietly that even the commas feel sleepy. A no 1 is the standard. A no 2 is sometimes almost identical. A giant is often 50 millimeters and leads a short but confident life, holding together memos that use the word initiative. In some offices, there is also the Colossus clip, which seems to exist mostly so that people can say, "Please hand me the big one." The standards do not legislate what is in the soul of a paperclip because this is impossible, but they ensure that when you buy a box of 100, you get approximately 100 and not 98, plus a bonus staple, which is the kind of treachery that ruins afternoons. The paperclip's carbon footprint is small enough to be almost metaphorical. A kilogram of wire becomes thousands of clips. If you keep a clip for decades, and people do, there are clips in drawers that remember typewriters. Its per-day cost becomes friendly. Reuse is its religion. A good clip straightens and returns to service. Even a badly bent clip can become a tool, a hook, a bookmark for a recipe that promises cinnamon and patience. When a clip finally refuses to hold anything but a grudge, you can drop it into a recycling jar with a little clink that feels like confession. In an era that measures everything, the paperclip is modest about its numbers. Its largest boast is that in 2017, an artist proposed a monument to the clip in a Norwegian town where a supposed inventor once lived. Whether the inventor truly invented or simply inspired is debated. The monument, a large iron loop, solves the argument by existing. If an alien civilization telephoned politely and asked for a single object that explained human administration, something small enough to mail, the paperclip would be a strong candidate. It says we write things down, we prefer sheets to scatter, and we like to believe our stacks can be rearranged. It is not permanent like a staple, which perforates and commits. It is not adhesive like tape, which ages into amber and regrets. It is not a string, which requires knots and trust. The paperclip is provisional, our most honest category. It holds until we know better, which is how most decisions are made at lunchtime. It is also comfortable with being removed without leaving a scar, a virtue admired in houseguests and punctuation. By this hour, the desk is quieter. The screen waits. The lamp pulls. The hum of a building falls to a purr. On the table lies a small drift of paper clips, silver with a few blue and red. Pick one up. Feel its slight spring. Turn it between finger and thumb. You can sense the geometry under the skin. 2 loops, a path for paper, a promise to hold not by force but by agreement. Slide it onto a page, and the metal whispers against the fiber, a sound so neat that libraries would shelve it in the etiquette section. A single clip is not dramatic, not brave, not even interested in being remembered. But the clip is part of a chorus, and the chorus is what offices were designed to conduct. Somewhere down the hall, a drawer closes, and 100 small loops settle into their box like minnows in a calm pond. They do not know what they will hold tomorrow: reports, recipes, postcards. The first page of a novel that is hiding in a folder, but they are ready indefinitely to help. And you, with a clip between your fingers, might notice your breathing has adopted the same calm loop, in, around, back again.